What would you do to survive if you were stranded in the Andes Mountains? All rescue efforts were abandoned, and it was up to you to get out of there alive. Hi, guys. Welcome to Crinkles Corner. This is episode 2. Thank you guys so much for tuning in, and please be sure to subscribe and hit the little bell. That way you get notified of our new episodes. On Friday the 13th, October 1972, a rugby team from Montevideo, Uruguay was getting ready to depart for a match in Santiago, Chile, when something completely unexpected occurred, and now they were fighting for their lives. It was going to be a short trip. It was planned for 4 days. They would leave on Thursday and return on a Monday. And the rugby team, they didn't have a lot of funds, so chartering a plane was the most affordable option they had. And because on this small plane, they had extra seats and extra room for any family members or friends that wanted to go and attend the match, for them to come along. So the players invite their parents, siblings, friends, and they board craft 571 en route to Santiago, Chile. So they're in the air on the way to Chile. Everyone's having a really good time. Everyone is pumped. Everyone's excited, laughing. The vibe in this plane was very energetic, and everyone seemed to be in really good spirits. The captain of the plane was very experienced. He was a military colonel. He had completed the crossing through the Andes Mountains 29 times. He knew how the weather would change, how to fly above the mountains. He was very experienced. The pilot and the co-pilot would decide to fly through Planchon Pass. It would allow them to fly at a lower altitude. Normally, going over the Andes Mountains, you would have to fly at a higher altitude, and it would cause a lot of stress to the craft. So flying through Planchon Pass would allow them to fly lower. That way, there's not too much turbulence. During the route, the pilots at some point made a mistake and miscalculated where exactly they were. To the air traffic controllers, they stated that they were in Curico, which means they would have crossed the Palancho Pass in 3 minutes, when in actuality, that crossing takes about 11 minutes. So the pilots are now thinking they're in the clear, and they make a catastrophic decision of turning north right into the Andes Mountains. That decision would change the fate of all the passengers in that plane. The pilots then chose to descend the craft, and they couldn't see the mountaintops due to all the clouds. At first, they began to experience light turbulence. Then the plane started to shake a little. The flight attendant would go on to announce for everyone to sit down and fasten their seatbelts. The turbulence begins to get worse. Everyone's holding on to the armrests, and the mood changes. No one is laughing anymore. People are now scared, they're concerned, they're worried. The pilots are continuing to descend, thinking they're past Curico and they're in Chile. As they get closer and closer to the mountains, the plane starts to shake a lot. And the turbulence is scary, becoming dangerous. They fly through the clouds, and on the other side, they realize they're completely surrounded by rocks and mountains. Now everyone is in a panic, and within a matter of seconds, they begin to realize something is horribly wrong. One of the passengers says, "We're gonna crash." The pilot decides that the best way to prevent a horrible crash is to fly in between two peaks. But this wouldn't go the way he thought it was. They would end up hitting a peak and a wing would fly off. This would cause the plane to start turning, and the back of the plane would also break off, and all that was left was the fuselage, which would slide down all the way down this mountain. The traffic controllers would radio in Flight 571. "Are you there? Can you hear me? What's your location?" But there was no answer. Friday the 13th at 3:32 p.m., Flight 571 would crash into the Andes Mountains. And it was luck that the plane didn't disintegrate altogether. It was miraculous that there was so many survivors. Yes, some did pass and some were injured badly, but there were survivors that had minor injuries. But as time went on, things would turn very chilling. In the initial crash, 12 were killed, including one pilot and two crew members. And the names of the people that passed away are listed online, so you can go and see those. I just rather not say for privacy reasons. 33 survived, including some being critically injured. The plane would come to a stop at an elevation of approximately 11,800 feet. None of the players were familiar with snow. They're from Uruguay. Snow is something rare and new to them. At the crash site, it was devastating. There was blood everywhere. There was unalived people everywhere. Immediately after the crash, those who were able would help others who were injured. One passenger had flown from the front seat of the plane all the way to the back of the plane. His face was extremely swollen. Another passenger's body was wrapped around a seat, and you automatically knew, them being in that position, that they were not alive. The co-pilot was pinned and could not get out of the position he was in. And he was in a lot of pain, and he would yell out to the passengers to bring him a pistol because he just wanted to end it. Now, before this co-pilot would pass away, the crew and the members would hear him yell, "We passed Curico, we passed Curico," throughout this story. That is the only thing these passengers know about their location. The passengers would start looking at a map that was left on the plane, and they could clearly see that Curico was in Chile. They thought, we are in Chile. And that's when they began to realize, okay, we are in the western part of Chile, on the western side of the Andes Mountains. But come to find out, the pilots had made a mistake when they were doing their calculations on their location. And they were not in Chile. They had not passed Curico, but instead they were in Argentina. The location of the crash site was extremely remote. So remote that the surrounding mountains, they don't have names. They haven't been named. No one has been out there. It was a valley full of glaciers, 12,000 feet in the middle of the Andes. And still to this day, that area is very remote. It feels like stepping into a freezer, surrounded by peaks on all three sides. Peaks that are 14, 15, 16,000 feet high. There's an east volcano that's 18,000 feet high. Sheer, steep walls filled with snow. Their survivors immediately went into survival mode. They start rummaging through all the items, through people's suitcases to find more clothes. I mean, these people were dressed for summer. They didn't have heavy coats. They didn't have anything that was warm enough. The first night was horrible because the sunset was at 4 p.m. So they had to wait 15 hours to see daylight again, for the sun to rise again, to give them a little bit of warmth. They would huddle together to stay warm, to have that body heat. That way their bodies could adjust to the elevation. At nighttime, the temperatures would drop 30 degrees below zero, and 5 more would pass away. Day 2, the survivors would hear a plane fly over them, and they got so happy. They were waving their hands in the air. They thought rescue was here and they were about to go home, only to realize that no one could see them. The plane that they were all in, the cabin part of the plane, was white, and it was kind of in the snow. Part of it was in the snow, and from high above, it almost blends in. So no one was going to see them. As more survivors would pass away, they would move their bodies out from the fuselage to make more room for themselves. They were running out of food. They found a little bit of liquor, which liquor is a good thing to have in this type of climate. Liquor keeps your body warm. So they had a little bit of that, and they would share it in these tiny cups. They would pour a little bit in and drink it and pass it around. The plane only carried enough food to feed 9 to 10 adults for 24 hours. It was not nearly enough food. We're on day 3 now, and one of the passengers had suffered a head injury. Others would think that he was basically dead. So they would place him near the end of the fuselage where all the cold would kind of come in. They would place him there. Medical professionals would go on to say that him being in that placement with all that air actually saved his life. It's what ultimately kept him alive. Now, the traffic controllers and the airspace officials knew, obviously, that something had gone wrong with Flight 571. They knew it was still missing. So Chile and Argentina would perform routes to try to search for them. They would go through the known path that Flight 571 had taken, and they would see absolutely nothing. Search teams from 3 different countries were looking, and they would all fail to spot them. Now, this is the first time ever back then that 3 countries would come together to search for Flight 571. That had never happened before. Everyone had believed if the plane had crashed, everyone was most likely dead. There would be no survivors. It's now day 10. There is 27 survivors. This would go on to be one of the saddest days, because this is when they would listen on this little radio that they had on the plane. They would listen and hear that all rescue efforts were abandoned. Their hope had disappeared. I mean, before they knew this, they still had hope that someone would go and try to look for them and try to find them, because they knew, like, we never made it to the match. We never made it to Chile. They know we're missing. They know we crashed. They're gonna come and look for us, or at least try to, come and get our body. This is when I think in their minds they really kicked it into high gear, that we have to survive. We are on our own, and it's up to us to make it out of here. They start thinking of what they're going to eat to survive, what they have, what can they make. I mean, they're in a very remote part in the snow, in a very cold place. There's not very many insects, plants, animals that they can hunt for. They don't really have any of that. And this is when one of the players tells his teammate, I think I want to eat the pilot. His teammate is like, what? You're going crazy. You've officially gone crazy. He then goes and tells the other teammates, like, yo, this guy is thinking about eating the pilot. And the other teammates are like, you know what? We got to do something to stay alive. We were thinking the exact same thing. So everyone is kind of in agreement that this may be something they have to do in order to stay alive. I mean, they had no food. They were facing starvation. They were stressed, scared, cold. They were thirsty. There was not much water. When humans face starvation, what happens is we start taking all the food supplies from our liver. The next thing to go is typically our muscle, and then our fatty tissue, and then we start to digest our internal organs, and they needed food source. The survivors would have to get creative to get water. They would bend the metal back part of the seat into kind of into like a funnel to collect snow, and it would be kind of like a deep funnel, and that's where they would collect the snow, and the snow would melt and it would turn into water, and that's how they were getting water. The survival instinct is probably the strongest instinct we have as humans. The thought to eat another human in their minds was kind of like a religious analogy, like, here's the body of Christ. They kind of thought it like that. That was their way of justifying it. The only tools they had with them was a screwdriver and an axe, which is kind of odd. Like, why do you need an axe on a plane? But that's all they had. So therefore, they had to build and make other tools. They would make knives from the plastic of the window. That way they had something to kind of cut the meat up with. And when researchers would go to that site after the crash, they would end up finding one of those homemade knives, which was pretty cool. So we're at 10 days after the crash, and this is when they cut open their first body. I can't imagine what's going on in their minds as they're putting this piece of human flesh up to their mouths. I mean, it has to smell, right? I'm assuming they're thinking this is protein, this will give us strength and energy. They didn't really have fires. They couldn't really make fires because they didn't have the paper source to burn for these fires. They didn't have wood. They would go on to eat most of the bodies. Like, you could see nothing, no meat was left. In this photo, you can see there in the corner, that's just the spine. There is no meat left. It's so chilling to see that. It was to them survival food. They're not cannibals. They didn't kill for the joy of eating. These bodies were already gone. These people were already gone. This was what they had to do to survive. They would make a pact amongst themselves. They would say, if one of us dies, you have my permission to eat my body. That way, everyone was kind of in an agreement that, yes, you can eat me. Allowed them to feel better, to know that they had that approval, or they knew they could go on and eat a teammate if they had to. Things would only get worse. We're at day 18. They're still 27 of them are still alive. So where this fuselage, that was an area that would normally get hit by avalanches. But now they didn't know about avalanches because they weren't familiar with snow. And it was only a matter of time before that happened. It's estimated that about 250 avalanches hit the Andes every year. They're heavy, strong, and dangerous. They can wipe out metal bridges. They can take trains off their tracks. These are no joke. These are strong blocks of snow. For 3 consecutive days, it was snowing constantly. So much that the fuselage would be covered in snow. Sometimes avalanches, when they're about to hit or when they have hit and they're coming, they make a loud boom sound. Sometimes they make like hissing noises, but other times they're completely silent. The survivors were sleeping one night and they hear this loud boom sound. It sounds like a pack of horses are coming right at them, like a horse stampede. It was lightning fast, and an avalanche would hit. The fuselage where they were sleeping. It was going so fast that the avalanche would blow right into the fuselage. Not only would it go above and all around, but it would also blow right into it. This avalanche was so strong that some of them were stuck in twisted positions where they were in a lot of pain and they couldn't move. They couldn't breathe. 75% of people who are buried in an avalanche end up passing away due to asphyxiation. You can only survive about 3 to 4 minutes without oxygen. And once they started digging their way out, one would help the other dig themselves out, and they would start to help each other. 8 of those survivors would end up passing away, including another crew member. Now there is 19 remaining survivors. What an unimaginable situation to be experiencing. I can't imagine how they still have hope at this point, Like, I would have given up I would have been like, eat me, go ahead. Like, I cannot take any more suffering and pain and hunger. This story of survival would have so many extreme moments. They would ask each other and tell each other, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? One of the teammates would say, let's keep fighting until we're dead. They would use the handles from the rolling carry-on suitcases. They would use that handle to kind of push it up into the roof of the fuselage and dig a hole into it. That way they could start crawling out of it because they were buried in there. This avalanche would, in a strange way, help them survive because they were covered from any additional snow. Now they were thinking, okay, we can survive at least one more month now that we have these 8 extra bodies. And after working so hard to make these holes in the fuselage, after 3 days, they managed to all dig themselves out of the avalanche. Over the next few weeks, they would develop a routine to gather this melted snow that would then turn into water. They would find some comfort inside this fuselage. That has been their place where they've slept. If they were outside when this avalanche would happen, I don't think they would have survived. But because they were inside the fuselage, that was their kind of safety net. They would go on to take small treks and hikes to kind of see their surroundings, to see what else was over there. But they would come right back. Like, these were not long hikes because it was so hard to walk in this snow. The depth of the snow at their crash site was said to be up to 100 feet. I mean, just walking in like regular snow is difficult. I can't imagine 100 feet of snow. They would try to walk and go explore, but would come back because their eyes were blinded. They couldn't see because they had no sunglasses and the sun and the light was just so bright and their eyes would burn. At this point, they're all thinking it's easier to just die than to try to stay alive. They would make these snowshoes by cross-tying cables and the seat belts from the airplane seats. And they would strap the cushions from the seats to the bottom. And that's how they would make like snowshoes. Now it's November. It is 1 month after the crash. 3 of the teammates would decide to go on an expedition. They would decide on 3 of the most fit that in their minds could make this expedition or could make it to further than they have tried before. They would go as far as they could. And then they would come back to the crash site just to see how much they could endure, to see how far they could get before they couldn't go anymore. Like, their bodies just couldn't handle it. And while they're out walking and exploring, they come across the tail of the plane that had broken off when the plane was going in circles. They began rummaging through that stuff, through the suitcases. They would find another little box of chocolates. They would also find some rum. And they would find a camera along with 24-volt batteries. In their minds, they thought, maybe we can use these batteries to make the larger radio that you use for calling, to make that radio work. They decided to spend the night there in the tail of the plane. The next day, they would make their trek back to the fuselage to see if they could fix that radio, to try to call for help. They couldn't figure it out. There was so many cables, so many wires. They were becoming depressed and so discouraged. With that camera that they had found, they decided, let's take some group photos. Let's take some team photos, because later on, when rescue teams or whoever is out here finds this camera, they can develop the film and they can see that we were all still alive. So they wanted to take photos. One night, one of the teammates stated that they were in a lot of pain. So another team member began performing CPR. For about an hour, he just kept doing compressions and compressions and compressions. When he would stop the CPR, the teammate that was in pain would state that he felt like he was dead and he would die not long after that. But he would die with a smile on his face. So that would bring comfort to the other teammates and the other survivors that at least in that final moment, there was somewhat of happiness in him. 3 days later, another teammate would also pass away due to an infection that would spread because of their untreated wounds. One member would become repulsed by the human meat. He couldn't stand the smell. He could no longer consume anymore. He would stop eating and he would go on to pass away weighing 50 pounds. Now, these are rugby players. Rugby players tend to be bulkier, stockier, heavier. They have a lot of muscle, and this individual would pass away weighing only 50 pounds. They would go on to remember this particular teammate as such an amazing human being because despite all that has happened to them, not once did he complain. When he could no longer eat the meat, he didn't complain. He just kept it to himself and would state that they really loved him. It's now December, 2 months after the plane crash. Only 16 of the original 45 passengers are alive. Many of the ones that have passed away have been consumed. They only had a few bodies remaining. Their food source was becoming less and less. There was a 15-foot mountain. It blocks the west route to Chile, which is where they would have to go for survival. That was their direction that they would have to hike and trek through to find civilization. In their minds, they didn't know that these pilots, the pilot and the co-pilot, had inaccurate details about their location. They didn't know that. But the survivors had no idea that if they would have gone east, if they would have trekked and hiked east into this downhill valley, there's a hotel 18 miles away from them. They had no clue. We're at day 60 now. One of the teammates was so eager to leave, to get out of there. He had so much motivation to live, to survive, to go to his remaining surviving family members back home. He wanted to make it out of there alive. While a lot of the other players had lost hope, they weren't being very supportive to the idea of hiking and trekking. They had no idea how long this would take, where it would lead them, if they would even make it out alive. They weren't being very positive, which understandable. So those three that were the most fit decided to set out on an actual expedition to get to civilization, to get to somewhere or see someone where they could ask for help. They would bring with them their homemade sleeping bags that had been made from the insulation of the plane. They would use a needle and copper wire to sew the insulation together to create the sleeping bags. Before they began their expedition, one of the teammates would ask another teammate, "Hey, I want to kiss your rosary before you leave." And so he did. They would carry with them a 3-day ration of human meat inside a sock. At the altitude that they were at, they would describe breathing to be very difficult. Every time they would take a breath, it would feel like they weren't really getting any kind of oxygen. They would get to a very high climbing point. They had 2 feet of climbing to do at a 45-degree angle, and the elevation was at 4,447 feet, which is quite steep. They would go on to move towards the rock and use the rocks to climb because that was easier for them than to try to climb through all the snow. But then you had to be very careful because as they were climbing, some of these rocks would come loose and they would tumble down at a very fast speed. So you were climbing and you were having to dodge these rocks that were coming at you very quickly. They would reach the summit, but it would be a false summit. They would look around and just see all these other peaks surrounding them. They would have to really motivate themselves to keep going. They would talk to themselves and kind of give themselves like a pep talk, like, we got to keep going. They had that rum with them that they had found at the tail of the plane, and they would take breaks. They would sit and watch the sunset and drink their rum. They would look at the scenery and their view. Wow, this is so beautiful. Look at this scenery. Look at the sun going down. It would take them 3 days to make it to the peak, to make it to the summit. And in their minds, they were only thinking it was going to take 1 day. And as they were making this climb to the peak, their teammates that stayed back at the fuselage could see them. They could see them climb and they could slowly start to see them turn into little specks. Now they're at the top of the summit when one of the teammates is like, oh my God, there's a road over there. And now they're still pretty far away from this road. And the other teammate's like, no, that's not a road. But it was. It turned out to be a road. The only thing is that this road was in the opposite direction of where they were headed. This road was over here. They were headed over there. They began to go back and forth, arguing and debating. Should we go this way where I can see a road, or should we continue our path thinking that we're already in Chile when we're not? Should we continue the original path? So they decide to continue to their original path. And come to find out, that was a road that one of the teammates had seen. That was a road. Once they would reach another summit, they would drop down to their knees and they just felt like crying. It was really hard on their bodies. One of the teammates was starting to fall behind. More and more and more mountains as far as they could see. And it was more and more snow. At that point, the three of them made a pact to just keep going until they eventually pass away. I mean, there's no turning back for them now. We're at day 63. The supply of human flesh was running dangerously low. They made the decision to let one of the teammates go back to the fuselage. It was the teammate that was struggling to keep up with them, and he just looked really bad and tired and afraid that he would soon pass away. So they made the decision for him to return to the fuselage and give them his ration of the human flesh he had, while the other two would continue their excursion. As they continued, they would come to another peak where they would spot two other peaks in the distance that had no snow on top of them. They would also see the moisture from the Pacific Ocean. So they knew they were getting close to warmer weather, which would help them on this excursion. Those two peaks would be about 80 miles away. They were at the point of no return. They couldn't go back. If they went back, they wouldn't survive the trek back. They had to keep going until, like they said before, until they die. The two remaining on the excursion would go on to hike, to trek, to climb for 10 more days. At this point, one of them had lost 60 pounds and the other had lost 40 pounds throughout their excursion. They would go on to suffer immensely in those 10 days. The lack of food, the cold. They were out of rum, so they didn't have any more alcohol to warm up their bodies. They would finally go on to reach a point where there was no more snow. There wasn't that much snow on it. The temperature even felt warmer. That would also mean that the remaining of their food supply would go bad. There was no more ice and cold and freezing temps to keep that human flesh good. It was going bad. We're at day 69 since the crash. The others waiting at the fuselage had lost hope at this point. It had been 10 days, although they didn't really know how long this excursion would take. They were already giving up, and now this excursion was taking so long. Like 10 days for us living our day-to-day lives is really nothing. It goes by so fast. But to them who are stranded with nothing, absolutely nothing but themselves, 10 days feels like an eternity to them. And they are losing hope. They're like, they're not coming back. They probably died on those mountains. Meanwhile, the two that are on the expedition, they start to hear running water, like it's coming from a lake or a river, or they began to run towards the sound of the water. And they come to like a really small river that was coming down from the mountain. So it was the melted ice. They also began to see green spots of grass. They knew that they were getting closer and closer to civilization because they spotted a cow. They saw one cow. This is significant. This means we're almost there. They had trekked over 40 miles through the Andes Mountains. The moment they realized that they were going to survive is when they were resting, and they were kind of just like on a break, taking a deep breath, looking around, and one of them spots a man on a horse. And he says to the other, "Look, there's a man on a horse right across that river." That man on a horse ended up being a rancher from Chile. They thought, what a relief. We see someone. We have a chance. We are going to make it out of here alive. We're now at day 70 after the plane crash. They spotted this rancher across this river, but it was so hard to communicate with him, to speak to him, to yell at him, because of the noise of this raging river that was in between them. The rancher would spot them. He would see them, and then the two survivors were waving their hands and yelling and trying to let him know, we're here, we're alive, like look at us. But there was no way that they could cross this river. It was way too dangerous. They would stay in that spot where they saw the rancher overnight. And they slowly began to lose sight of the rancher. They could no longer see. But they were so happy because they knew that that rancher had seen them. They knew that the rancher knew that they were there. And they would hope that he would return with help or food or something. The next morning around 5:30 a.m., they would spot a small fire near the shore at the edge of the river on the other side. The rancher, the guy on the other side, would get a piece of paper with a small, tiny pencil, wrap it around a rock, tie it up, and toss it to them over this river. What a smart man. They would receive this, survivors would go and write a note on that piece of paper. He would go on to state, we are two of the survivors that were involved in that plane crash in the Andes Mountains. We've been staying alive, like we've been trying to survive for 2 months now. He also wrote that they were from Uruguay and that there were 14 additional survivors at the crash site waiting. His last sentence would say, where are we? Because they had no clue where they were. They thought they were already in Chile, but he would then wrap the paper back up in the rock and throw it across the river back to the rancher. The rancher would read this note and then look up at them in shock. He would read it and then look up again in disbelief. He couldn't believe what he was reading. The rancher would go on to wave his hand up in the air like saying, wait there, wait there. The rancher would get back on his horse, but before leaving to go find help for them, he would throw across the river some bread and some cheese for them to eat. This bread and cheese would be their first meal that they've had since the plane crash. They have been eating human flesh to stay alive. And before that, it was tiny pieces of chocolate and alcohol. So this was first actual meal, this bread and this cheese. It would take the rancher 10 hours to get back to the nearest town. But when he finally came back to where the survivors were, he had with him 4-5 military men on horses. They were so happy, and happy is an understatement here. They were elated. They were just, the relief they must have felt, like the stress, everything that just, all the heaviness that they had been carrying for all this time, for 2 months, just like fell off of them. It was December 22nd, 1972, 71 days after the plane crash. A sudden reality hit them when they started to see journalists, people, news reporters. News reporter would go on to ask them, what did you guys eat to stay alive? They would reject that question. They would just go on to not answer it. They would also ask, where are all the other survivors? They would draw a map for the rescuers and draw a circle where the crash site happened. The rescuers would be like, that's not Chile, that's Argentina. They couldn't believe that these two had crossed the Andes Mountains on foot. They were shocked. They would reassure the news outlets. I don't know where that is. I just know that is where we crashed. I don't know if it's Chile, Argentina. That is our crash site, though. At the crash site, the remaining survivors had that small radio. It stated that 2 men appeared from the Andes Mountains. These 2 men were survivors from the 571 flight. It stated that they were from Uruguay and gave a lot of details about these 2 men. And that's when the remaining survivors at the fuselage knew that they were still alive, that they had made it, that they had found help. They were so happy. They were celebrating. They were hugging each other. And they finally realized, we are going to get out of here alive. So happy, to the point of tears. It was described that they were like crazy men running around this radio listening to that. They were finally going to get out of there. The rescue efforts began. They called for 2 helicopters. One of the survivors had drew a circle where the crash site was. The pilot of the helicopters, the rescue search team, said, there's no way we're going to find them there. You have to come with us. Imagine that feeling of just surviving this horrific plane crash only to be told you have to get in a helicopter and go back to the crash site. That would have been so triggering. And honestly, I wouldn't have wanted to do that. I would have probably wanted to stay as far away from any helicopter, airplane, jet, anything for a really long time. But this survivor knew that he had to go because he had to help find and locate his teammates, the remaining survivors. He had to go and help them. So he got in this helicopter and they began their flight back to the crash site. As they got closer to the crash site, the helicopter began to shake, and the pilot would say, this is too much pressure. My helicopter cannot handle this. The plexiglass from the window was vibrating so hard. And they would finally cross over the mountains. The pilot kind of faced the helicopter downward, and that's when they were able to spot. That's when the survivor said, there, right there. They were able to spot the crash site and the survivors. The fuselage was white. It wasn't until they were about 300 yards away from the crash site that they were able to even spot anything. They were able to see tiny, tiny specks of people. There they were, waving their hands in the air, happy, jumping up and down. They thought, they're coming for us. They're finally rescuing us. They would land and open up the helicopter door, and three of them would just run to hug the survivor that had made the expedition. They would just jump on him and were embracing him and were so happy to see him alive. Early the next morning, all of these survivors would be rescued and transported to safety. All the family members of the survivors began to be notified. They would fly out to San Fernando, Chile, which is where they were being held at a hospital to get their check-ins, to make sure that everyone was getting back on track with nutrition and getting them healthy and strong again. As the news began to break out back home in Uruguay, another devastating blow would happen to the survivors. The media and all news outlets and newspapers and articles, they were being called cannibals. People were bashing them, saying horrible things about them and their morals and just their conscience, on how they could even eat family members, friends, teammates, how they could eat other humans. They received so much backlash and were being called animals. And it wasn't until a Catholic priest came out on record to say they did the right thing. They're not cannibals. They didn't kill these people pleasure or to see how it felt to eat a human being. They weren't doing this out of malice or out of curiosity. They did this to survive. They did the right thing. They're not cannibals. They're not evil humans. They're not monsters. They did this out of necessity. And after that, after the priest came out and stated that, everyone else started to change their minds and started to feel differently. And thankfully, they gained that support from these people. I can't even imagine surviving the hell that they had just survived, to come back home and making them feel bad for the decisions that they made out there in the middle of nowhere. No one was looking for them anymore. People thought they were dead. They had to do what they had to do to survive, and now they were facing this backlash. Like, I can't imagine how they must have felt, but thankfully they were able to get support from people, and were able to kind of repair the narrative and what people were thinking about them. Following all this, and as they repaired their lives, got back into their normal daily routines and worked on their mental health and getting back to a place where not normal, but back to they can go throughout their daily lives, they decided all together to write a book about their experiences. We know all these details because they were able to go on and write a book and tell their story from their eyes, their point of view, their experiences. As time went on and they were older and they had families of their own, two of the teammates and their families would return to Chile. They would visit with their families. During one visit, they actually ran into the rancher. The rancher would go on to take a photo with them and talk to him. And it brought so much joy to all three of them, the two survivors and the ranchers. And the rancher said that he would never forget them. The survivors would go on to visit Chile anytime they got. This whole story is just a true testament and proof that if you want it bad enough, you can survive. You can do things that you never thought you would do in order to survive. Stay positive and not give up and continue fighting. Even if they died fighting, they lost family members, they've had to make very tough, hard decisions in order to survive, in order to keep fighting and keep going. And I think this story is not talked about enough. And I hope you guys enjoyed listening to this story. And please let me know if there's any cases that you would like to hear more of or that you're interested about. Please feel free to Tell me how you thought about this episode. It was such a crazy episode. When I was doing my research, some things I just found so unbelievable, and I will be interacting with you guys in the comments if you want to. And I thank you guys so much for taking the time to come and watch my video and interact with me, and I hope to see you guys soon in the next video. Thank you guys for tuning in to Crinkle's Corner, and be sure to subscribe for the next episode. Bye.